when the word Machiavellian is spoken. It evokes shadows, whispers, hidden blades, smiling faces concealing betrayal, a world where power is pursued without mercy, and human beings are reduced to tools for ambition, and for more than 500 years. This single word has carried the weight of manipulation, cruelty, calculation, and cold intent, yet the truth behind the word is far more unsettling, because the man whose name became synonymous with evil never ruled a state, never commanded an army, never ordered executions, never poisoned rivals, and never seized power by force. He was a Florentine civil servant, a minor bureaucrat, who spent his days writing letters, filing reports, and serving a republic that would eventually discard him. He was a husband, a father of 6, a writer of forgettable love poetry, a composer of light comedies, and in his final years, a desperate petitioner, begging powerful men for employment, believing his life had amounted to failure. This contradiction between legend and reality is the entrance into the life of Niccolo Machiavelli, a man whose reputation grew darker with each generation, even as his own life faded into obscurity. He died poor, sick, and largely forgotten. His most famous book, unpublished, the republic he had served, destroyed, and both his enemies and former allies uninterested in his fate. And yet, within decades, his name would echo across Europe. As a symbol of satanic politics, his works banned by the church, his image transformed into a theatrical villain, and his ideas invoked by kings, philosophers, and moralists, as proof of corruption or as a warning of tyranny. How did an unsuccessful Florentine official become the most feared political thinker in Western history? And what if the adjective Machiavellian tells us less about the man himself, and more about our fear of seeing power clearly? To understand this, we must begin not with Machiavelli, the philosopher, but with Machiavelli, the product of Florence, a city where beauty and brutality coexisted, refined into equally exquisite arts. Florence in the late 15th century was unlike any other city in Europe, not the largest, not the seat of empire, yet unmatched in wealth, culture, and intellectual intensity. Its banks financed popes and monarchs, its gold circulated across the continent, and its artists redefined what humanity believed itself capable of creating. Beneath the shadow of the great cathedral, citizens argued in public squares about philosophy, poetry, and ancient language, convinced they were living in a rebirth of classical greatness. But beneath this brilliance lay a dangerous illusion, for Florence called itself a republic, a free city governed by its citizens, while in reality, power flowed through invisible channels, controlled by a single family, the Medici, who ruled without crowns or titles, mastering the art of appearing powerless, while shaping every meaningful decision through patronage, favors, and quiet intimidation. Lorenzo de' Medici embodied this paradox, ruling as a first citizen, while ensuring allies filled offices, and enemies vanished into exile or ruin. And from this political theater, a young Niccolo absorbed his first enduring lesson that power does not need to announce itself, and that what appears true often matters more than what is true. Into this city of contradictions, Machiavelli was born to a family rich in books, but poor in money. His father Bernardo, a lawyer excluded from political life by property requirements, compensated for lack of wealth with devotion to learning, filling the household with Latin classics, and teaching his son the history of ancient Rome. Niccolo grew up absorbing Livy, Cicero, Sallust, and Plutarch, learning that history was not dead, but alive, that republics were glorious, yet fragile, capable of greatness and self-destruction in equal measure. This education shaped him into an insider in thought, and an outsider by circumstance, a man trained to understand power, while denied the means to wield it. And as he matured, Florence itself began to fracture. The death of Lorenzo exposed the fragility of Medici dominance, and the city swung violently from humanist brilliance to religious fanaticism under Savonarola, a preacher who ruled through fear and prophecy, burning books, art, and vanities in the name of purity, and demonstrating to Machiavelli that words alone could move masses, but could not sustain power without force. Savonarola's rise and execution carved a lesson that would never leave him, that unarmed prophets always come to ruin when the friar fell. Florence rebuilt its republic, and in the chaos, a young Machiavelli entered government, beginning the work that would educate him more deeply than any book. As second chancellor, he wrote thousands of letters, managed intelligence, and observed firsthand the gap between public virtue and private necessity. Diplomacy taught him that states survive not through ideals, but through adaptation, calculation, and decisive action. And as he traveled across Europe, he watched kings, popes, and warlords navigate power with varying skill. None would shape him more deeply than Cesare Borgia, whose ruthless efficiency revealed both the terrifying effectiveness of cruelty used decisively and the limits imposed by fortune. Machiavelli did not admire cruelty for its own sake. He studied it as a physician studies disease, believing that refusing to understand the darker mechanics of politics was a dangerous form of blindness. This belief would later be distilled into words, but long before he wrote them, he lived them, witnessing republics fall, leaders fail, and ordinary people suffer. And when Florence itself collapsed under foreign invasion, Machiavelli lost everything: his office, his reputation, his freedom, and nearly his life. Tortured, imprisoned, and exiled, he retreated to the countryside, stripped of power, but not of thought. And it was there, in isolation, humiliation, and desperation, that he began to write, not as a monster, but as a man who had seen too much to lie to himself or others. And from this suffering emerged the foundations of a legacy that would outlive him for centuries, not because it comforted humanity, but because it refused to flatter it. And this refusal would turn Niccolo Machiavelli into a mirror that generations would blame for the truths it reflected. As Machiavelli moved deeper into the machinery of the Florentine Republic, his education and power accelerated rapidly, no longer drawn from books alone, but from daily exposure to the realities that polite political theory preferred to ignore. Florence, after the fall of Savonarola, was a city attempting to reinvent itself, shaken by religious extremism, foreign threats, and internal division, desperate to restore republican stability, while surrounded by monarchies and empires that viewed Italian city-states as prizes to be seized. Into this unstable environment, Machiavelli stepped not as a visionary reformer, but as a working official, tasked with managing correspondence, intelligence, and administration, responsibilities that demanded clarity, precision, and emotional detachment. He learned quickly that governments do not collapse in grand, dramatic moments, but through accumulated small failures, miscommunications, delays, and Every letter he drafted, every report he summarized, revealed the gap between how states presented themselves publicly and how decisions were actually made behind closed doors. Diplomacy became his classroom, and Italy his laboratory. As secretary to the Ten of War, he gained access to military planning alliances and intelligence that exposed the brutal truth that Florence was dangerously weak, dependent on mercenary soldiers whose loyalty extended only as far as their pay. Machiavelli watched these hired armies maneuver not to win decisively, but to survive comfortably. Battles fought like dances designed to minimize risk rather than secure victory. And he recognized that a republic relying on men with no stake in its survival was gambling its future. This realization hardened into conviction as he observed foreign powers circle Italy like predators. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire treating Italian states as expendable pieces in larger struggles. Machiavelli was dispatched repeatedly on diplomatic missions, traveling to courts where power was wielded openly rather than disguised behind republican rituals. In France, he saw a centralized monarchy capable of decisive action. In Rome, he witnessed popes behaving less like spiritual leaders and more like territorial princes. And in Germany, he observed an emperor whose grand titles masked chronic weakness and financial instability. Each mission sharpened his analytical instincts, teaching him to read not words but intentions, not promises but incentives. He paid attention to details others ignored. The mood of a ruler receiving bad news, the whispers among servants, the composition of inner circles, the subtle shifts that revealed where real authority lay. Politics, he learned, was not governed by ideals, but by pressures, fears, and necessities. And nowhere was this lesson more vividly embodied than in his encounter with Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. A man whose rise and fall would become central to Machiavelli's understanding of power. Borgia represented something unprecedented, a ruler unconstrained by tradition, morality, or custom. Driven purely by ambition and efficiency, Machiavelli followed him closely, observing how he consolidated territory through calculated brutality, eliminating rivals swiftly rather than allowing resistance to fester. Borgia did not rule through illusion or inherited legitimacy, but through fear, speed, and decisive action. And while Machiavelli never celebrated his cruelty, he recognized its effectiveness. The most searing lesson came at Senigallia, where Borgia lured rebellious captains into a false reconciliation, only to have them executed in a single stroke. Machiavelli witnessed the aftermath, the shock, the silence, the sudden absence of opposition, and he understood that Borgia had solved a lethal problem permanently. This moment crystallized what Machiavelli would later call virtue, not moral goodness, but the capacity to act effectively in the face of necessity. The ability to impose order on chaos, regardless of conventional ethics. Yet even here Machiavelli observed the limits of power. Borgia's empire collapsed almost as swiftly as it had risen when fortune turned against him. His father died, illness struck, alliances shifted, and the man who had mastered circumstances was undone by forces beyond his control. From this, Machiavelli learned that no amount of skill could fully conquer chance, that fortune governed at least half of human affairs, and that even the most capable rulers could be destroyed by timing and contingency. These observations were not abstract reflections, but conclusions drawn from lived experience, from years spent watching power succeed and fail at close range. And while Machiavelli sharpened his political insight, his personal life continued quietly in the background. He married Marietta Corsine, built a family, and wrote letters filled with humor, affection, and vulnerability, revealing a man far removed from the cold caricature later associated with his name. His private correspondence shows warmth, irony, and emotional depth. A human being capable of love, frustration, and joy, existing alongside the analyst of power. This duality is essential to understanding Machiavelli. He was not a man without morals, but a man unwilling to confuse moral wishes with political reality. His loyalty was not to cruelty, but to clarity. And this clarity drove him toward one of his most ambitious projects: the creation of a citizen militia for Florence. Convinced that republics could only survive if their citizens were willing to defend them, Machiavelli dedicated years to organizing, training, and drilling Florentine men, believing he was reviving the Roman model that had sustained republican liberty. This effort consumed him, blending theory and practice into a single vision of civic responsibility. When the militia achieved early success, capturing Pisa, Machiavelli believed he had proven his case: that citizens could fight, that Florence could defend itself without mercenaries, and that republican virtue could still triumph. But history would soon dismantle this hope with merciless speed. As European politics shifted and Florence found itself isolated, the militia was tested against hardened Spanish troops. The result was catastrophe. At Prato, the citizen soldiers broke. The city was sacked, and the republic collapsed almost overnight. For Machiavelli, this defeat was total, his military theory discredited, his political patrons overthrown, and his career destroyed. The Medici returned to power, and Machiavelli was dismissed, barred from office, fined, and confined. Years of service erased in weeks. This collapse was not merely professional, but existential. The world he understood vanished, leaving him stripped of purpose and identity. Yet even in this ruin, the lessons of his life continued to accumulate, teaching him that good intentions were no defense against reality, that virtue without strength invited destruction, and that history rewarded those who adapted rather than those who clung to ideals unprotected by force. These realizations would soon find expression not in action, but in writing, forged in exile, frustration, and desperate hope, as Machiavelli prepared unknowingly to enter the most consequential phase of his life. Exile transformed Machiavelli's understanding of power more deeply than any diplomatic mission ever had, because now he experienced its absence, cut off from the council's chambers and corridors where decisions were made, reduced to a small farm outside Florence where days were filled with manual concerns far beneath his intellect, managing crops, arguing with laborers, watching seasons change while the political world he once navigated with precision moved on without him. This humiliation was not quiet or noble. It was bitter, relentless, and psychologically corrosive. Machiavelli wrote letters describing how he felt himself decaying, his mind rusting from disuse, his identity dissolving as he was forced into a life that did not match his capacities. Yet this same isolation created the conditions for his most enduring work. Stripped of office, he turned inward, revisiting every lesson, every failure, every observation he had gathered across decades. Each evening after the day's labor, he performed a ritual that reveals everything about his inner life. He changed out of his dirty farm clothes and put on the formal garments he once wore in public service, as if stepping back into the role the world had taken from him. Then he entered his study and opened the books of the ancients. Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, conversing with the dead as equals, interrogating Roman history with the same rigor he once applied to living rulers. These hours were not nostalgic escape, but intellectual survival. Through them, Machiavelli began to synthesize experience and theory into something new, something dangerous, something radically honest. The result was The Prince, written not as philosophy, but as instruction, not as moral reflection, but as operational analysis, born from the perspective of a man who had seen power gained, lost, abused, and misunderstood. The Prince was shaped by urgency. Machiavelli believed he was writing for survival, not just his own, but Italy's. He watched his homeland carved apart by foreign powers because its rulers were weak, indecisive, and naive. And he concluded that traditional moral teaching had failed catastrophically. Rulers, educated to be good rather than effective, had led Italy into ruin. This conviction drove the book's brutal clarity. Machiavelli stripped away comforting illusions and replaced them with hard truths. He argued that a ruler's primary responsibility was not virtue but stability, not moral purity but survival of the state, because when the state collapses, morality collapses with it. Laws disappear, order dissolves, and cruelty multiplies far beyond anything a calculated ruler might have employed to prevent disaster. This inversion shocked readers because it challenged centuries of Christian political thought. But for Machiavelli, it was not rebellion against morality, but a redefinition of responsibility. He believed rulers must be judged by consequences, not intentions, by outcomes, not appearances, and that pretending otherwise was a form of self-deception that cost lives. He did not deny that cruelty was evil. He argued that uncontrolled chaos was worse, and that a ruler who refused to act decisively out of moral hesitation could unleash greater suffering than one who acted harshly but effectively. This logic permeated every chapter, whether discussing fear versus love, deception versus honesty, or generosity versus parsimony. Machiavelli's answers were never absolute but conditional, always grounded in circumstance, because flexibility was the core of political survival. A ruler who could not adapt would be destroyed by one who could. Yet the prince was not merely cynical advice. It was also deeply shaped by Machiavelli's sense of loss. Exile sharpened his realism, but also his desperation. The dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici was not flattery, but strategy. A final attempt to re-enter public life by proving his usefulness. Machiavelli hoped that by offering insight no one else dared articulate, he might be forgiven, restored, employed. But the silence that followed was devastating. The prince failed in its immediate purpose. Lorenzo ignored it. Machiavelli remained excluded, and the book circulated quietly in manuscript form rather than achieving public recognition. This rejection reinforced one of the book's core lessons. Merit alone does not guarantee reward. Timing, fortune, and perception often matter more. Yet even in failure, the work continued to live, its ideas spreading among readers who recognized their accuracy even as they recoiled from their implications. Machiavelli himself returned to obscurity, writing plays, histories, and letters, oscillating between humor, bitterness, and longing. But the intellectual transformation was complete. He had crossed a boundary few thinkers dared cross, separating politics from ethics, not to glorify power, but to understand it. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for a new way of thinking that would outlive him, though he could not yet know it. The work born of his exile would ensure that even as his body remained confined, his mind would never be. And the questions he raised would haunt rulers, republics, and philosophers long after Florence forgot his name. The ideas Machiavelli set down in The Prince did not emerge in isolation, but collided violently with the moral universe of his time. A world still dominated by Christian theology, where rulers were expected, at least publicly, to present themselves as virtuous shepherds accountable to God. Machiavelli shattered this framework by insisting that political life followed its own logic, governed not by divine reward, but by human behavior, fear, ambition, envy, gratitude, and forgetfulness. He observed that people are not consistently good or evil, but situational, loyal when it benefits them, faithless when it does not. and any ruler who ignored this reality would be destroyed by those who exploited it. This was not misanthropy, but empirical observation, distilled from years of watching republics collapse, alliances dissolve, and leaders fall because they trusted promises instead of preparing for betrayal. Central to this worldview was Machiavelli's concept of fortuna, the unpredictable force of chance, circumstance, and chaos that shapes events beyond human control. Fortuna could elevate a man suddenly or crush him without warning. But Machiavelli refused to accept fatalism. Instead, he argued that virtue, the quality of strength, intelligence, adaptability, and decisiveness, could resist fortune's blows. Virtue was not moral virtue, but effectiveness. The capacity to act boldly when opportunity arose, and ruthlessly when necessity demanded. History, in his view, belonged not to the morally pure, but to those who understood how to ride the tides of fortune rather than drown beneath them. This emphasis on action explains his fascination with figures like Cesare Borgia, whom he admired not for cruelty itself, but for decisiveness. Borgia acted when others hesitated, consolidated power swiftly, and eliminated threats before they could grow. His failure did not invalidate the method, but revealed its incompleteness. Because even the most ruthless ruler must anticipate succession, institutional stability, and the limits of personal power. From this Machiavelli derived a deeper lesson, that power, based solely on fear, collapses the moment fear weakens, and that lasting rule requires structures, laws, and institutions capable of functioning beyond the individual. This insight linked the prince to his later and more expansive work, the Discourses on Livy, where his true republican sympathies emerged more clearly. There he argued that republics, when properly organized, were superior to principalities because they distributed power, created resilience, and channeled human conflict into productive competition. Machiavelli did not contradict himself. He adapted his analysis to circumstance. Princes were necessary where corruption was deep and order broken. Republics flourished where civic virtue still survived. This flexibility is what made his thought so unsettling. It refused easy categories. He was neither purely authoritarian nor purely democratic, neither moralist nor nihilist, but relentlessly contextual, always asking what works here now under these conditions. Such thinking made him dangerous to ideologues of every kind, because it undermined absolutes. Over time, these ideas began to spread beyond Italy. Read secretly by rulers, condemned publicly by clergy, debated quietly by scholars. Machiavelli became a mirror people did not want to look into because it reflected their own behavior stripped of justification. His name became an insult even as his insights became indispensable. This paradox defined his legacy, the man despised in theory and followed in practice, misunderstood as an advocate of evil when he was in fact a diagnostician of power, describing symptoms rather than prescribing pleasure. And as Europe moved toward the modern state with standing armies, centralized authority, and bureaucratic control, his relevance only increased, because the world was becoming more Machiavellian, whether it admitted it or not. And the uncomfortable truth he revealed was that politics had never been innocent, it had only pretended to be. As Machiavelli's reputation spread, his ideas began to detach from the man himself, transforming into a symbol that frightened people far more than his actual words. Machiavellian came to mean deceit, cruelty, and heartless manipulation, yet this caricature obscured a more complex reality. Machiavelli never urged rulers to be cruel for pleasure or dishonest without reason. He warned repeatedly that unnecessary violence breeds hatred, and hatred breeds downfall. Cruelty had to be swift, limited, and purposeful. Deception had to serve stability, not vanity. His real enemy was not morality, but hypocrisy. The gap between what rulers claimed publicly and what they practiced privately. He saw Christian Europe preaching humility, mercy, and justice while engaging in endless wars, betrayals, and exploitation. His work tore away the comforting lie that politics was guided by virtue and exposed it as a realm driven by fear, interest, and power. This exposure terrified institutions built on moral authority because it undermined their legitimacy. If rulers ruled not by divine right, but by force and calculation, then obedience was no longer sacred, but contingent. This is why the Church reacted so strongly, placing the prince on the index of forbidden books, condemning it as diabolical not because it invented evil, but because it named it plainly. Protestant reformers echoed this outrage, yet quietly absorbed the same realist logic when governing their own states. The Reformation itself, with its alliances, wars, and power struggles, followed patterns Machiavelli described with unsettling accuracy. Beyond theology, his influence reshaped how history was written and understood. Instead of seeing events as expressions of God's will, he treated them as consequences of human decisions and structural conditions. Geography, economics, military organization, and psychology mattered more than providence. This approach marked a turning point in Western thought, the birth of political science as an empirical discipline rather than a branch of moral philosophy. Future thinkers would adopt this lens even when rejecting his conclusions. Hobbes took Machiavelli's realism and built a theory of sovereignty grounded in fear and security. Spinoza echoed his rejection of moral illusion. Later, Enlightenment thinkers argued with him, but could not escape his framework. Even those who dreamed of ideal republics now had to confront the realities he exposed. Power does not disappear because we dislike it. Ambition does not vanish because we condemn it. Institutions must be designed for humans, as they are not as we wish them to be. This insight would later shape constitutional design checks and balances, separation of powers, and the assumption that competing interests can restrain one another. Machiavelli's realism, thus paradoxically, became a foundation for modern liberty. By acknowledging self-interest openly, it allowed systems to channel it rather than be destroyed by it. This was his quiet revenge on those who dismissed him as a cynic. Because while they clung to comforting ideals, his ideas were building the modern state beneath their feet. And as Europe moved toward centralized authority, standing armies, and national sovereignty, Machiavelli's observations stopped seeming radical and began seeming obvious. The world had finally caught up to what he had seen centuries earlier. That power obeys its own laws, and ignoring them does not make you moral, it makes you dead. As centuries passed, Machiavelli's name continued to evolve from historical figure into myth and warning and justification all at once. Rulers invoked him to excuse brutality, critics invoked him to condemn tyranny, yet few read him carefully enough to notice how often he warned against excess. He understood that power without limits collapses under its own weight. Hatred once ignited cannot be controlled, and a ruler despised by his people lives in constant danger. This is why he emphasized appearances so strongly, not because he believed image was truth, but because public perception shapes political reality. People judge with their eyes, not with their minds, and a prince who ignores this does so at his peril. Virtue in politics becomes performance, yet performance still carries consequences. A ruler who appears just encourages order, even if his private calculations are cold. Machiavelli was describing a tragedy, not celebrating it. The tragedy that political survival often demands choices that corrode the soul. He never claimed this was good, only that it was real. This realism later haunted republics as much as monarchies, because citizens too learned to manipulate symbols, ideals, and fear. Revolutions preached liberty while practicing terror. Empires spoke of civilization while extracting wealth. The language changed, but the mechanics remained. This continuity is what made Machiavelli timeless. Every generation rediscovers him when ideals collide with reality. During the Enlightenment, thinkers attacked him in public while quietly adopting his methods in practice. During the French Revolution, leaders denounced tyranny while mastering propaganda and fear. During the modern age, democratic states learned to speak the language of rights, while conducting covert operations, assassinations, and proxy wars. Machiavelli's ghost lingered, not because he invented these practices, but because he explained them before anyone wanted them explained. He forced societies to confront an uncomfortable question. If power always operates this way, then how do you restrain it without pretending it is something else? His answer was indirect and often misunderstood. Strong institutions matter more than virtuous individuals. Laws outlast rulers, habits shape behavior, and systems must anticipate ambition, not deny it. This idea influenced republics far more than tyrannies, especially those that wished to survive without relying on exceptional leaders. In this sense, Machiavelli was closer to a constitutional thinker than a dictator's tutor. He distrusted human goodness, but believed in human predictability, and predictability could be designed around. The real danger he saw was narvit, not evil. States fall not because leaders are wicked, but because they misunderstand the world they live in. They trust promises without power, rely on morality without enforcement, and confuse hope with strategy. This blindness, he believed, doomed Italy to foreign domination and internal collapse. His harsh tone came from frustration, not malice. A man watching his homeland torn apart while its leaders clung to illusions. And so his legacy remained double-edged, feared by moralists, embraced by realists, misunderstood by both. Because he was not asking how to be good, but how to survive long enough for goodness to matter. And that question, once asked, can never be forgotten. As Machiavelli aged in enforced obscurity, his thinking grew broader, darker, and more reflective. Exile gave him distance, and that distance sharpened his understanding of how fragile political memory really is. Regimes fall quickly, loyalties evaporate, gratitude disappears, and yesterday's servant becomes today's traitor in the eyes of new rulers. He learned that power does not remember service, only usefulness. This lesson cut deeply, because he had served Florence faithfully yet was discarded without hesitation. And from this pain emerged one of his most important insights: that political systems must be designed to function without reliance on gratitude or loyalty, because these emotions decay faster than fear or interest. People remember benefits briefly, injuries forever, and leaders who rely on affection build on sand. This was not cynicism born of bitterness alone, but observation hardened by experience. He had seen republics collapse because citizens assumed shared values would hold indefinitely. He had seen alliances shatter the moment incentives changed. He had seen mercenary captains swear oaths and break them hours later. All of this convinced him that stability requires structures stronger than sentiment. Laws backed by force, institutions reinforced by habit and expectations, shaped by consequences. This belief drove his admiration for Rome not as a moral paradise, but as a machine that converted ambition into order. Roman greatness came not from virtuous citizens, but from relentless, disciplined checks and counterweights that forced even selfish men to serve the state. Conflict was not eliminated, it was managed. Class tension produced laws, military competition. produced expansion, and ambition found channels rather than exploding into chaos. Machiavelli believed Florence failed because it wanted harmony without structure and morality without enforcement. Its leaders hoped persuasion would replace coercion and debate would substitute for power. In a violent world, this hope was fatal. He was not opposed to liberty, but to illusion. Freedom without defense is an invitation to conquest. Virtue without vigilance becomes weakness, and peace without preparation is temporary. These ideas later unsettled republics that preferred comforting myths. Because Machiavelli insisted that freedom requires constant effort and sometimes harsh choices. Citizens must be willing to fight, serve, sacrifice, and accept discipline, or else surrender their autonomy to those who will impose order from outside. In this sense, his thought was a warning not just to rulers, but to societies. If you refuse the burdens of power, someone else will carry them for you and rule you in return. And so his work spoke across centuries to every fragile republic that mistook intention for capacity and ideals for protection. In the years that followed, Machiavelli watched the world move on without him. Yet the patterns he had described continued to repeat with eerie precision. New rulers rose, claiming virtue, renewal, and divine favor, only to adopt the same strategies of force, deception, and calculation. Once in power, this confirmed his belief that political behavior is shaped less by ideology than by circumstance. Men do not act according to what they claim to believe, but according to what survival demands. This is why he distrusted grand moral narratives. Not because morality was meaningless, but because it was often weaponized to disguise ambition. Every faction claims righteousness while pursuing advantage, and those who believe such claims, without scrutiny, become tools rather than actors. Machiavelli wanted readers to see through this veil, to recognize when language serves power rather than truth. This clarity made him dangerous, because it stripped politics of comforting lies and left only responsibility. Once you understand how power works, you can no longer plead innocence. You must choose whether to resist, accommodate, or rule with open eyes. This burden of awareness is heavy, and many prefer ignorance, which is why Machiavelli was hated more than ignored. He denied people the comfort of believing that history is guided by justice rather than force. Yet he also denied tyrants the excuse of destiny or divine will. Rulers could not claim they were instruments of God or fate. They were accountable for choices made consciously in pursuit of power. This subtlety is often lost. He was neither praising cruelty nor excusing it. He was assigning responsibility to human agency. Cruelty is chosen, not ordained. Deception is deliberate, not inevitable. And because it is chosen, it can be judged, resisted, or limited. This is why his work eventually became essential to those seeking to constrain power as much as those seeking to wield it. Constitutional designers, revolutionaries, and critics all found in his writing a mirror that showed what power does when unobserved. His influence on later political science came from this insistence on observation over aspiration. Study what happens, not what should happen. Identify patterns, not ideals. And build systems that anticipate failure rather than deny it. This approach transformed politics from moral philosophy into empirical inquiry. A shift that frightened many because it suggested that justice alone is insufficient without structure, that good intentions cannot compensate for weak institutions, and that ignorance is the most dangerous form of innocence. Machiavelli forced political thought to grow up, and in doing so ensured that his name would never be spoken without discomfort or debate. As Machiavelli's reputation spread after his death, the irony deepened, because the very societies that condemned him were quietly adopting the principles he had described. Monarchs centralized power, bureaucracies expanded, standing armies replaced feudal levies, and diplomacy became a game of permanent calculation rather than moral posturing. This was not because rulers had suddenly read the prints and turned evil, but because the realities of governing large competitive states demanded exactly the behaviors Machiavelli had analyzed. He became a convenient scapegoat, blamed for tendencies that predated him and would have existed without him. It was easier to accuse a dead Florentine secretary than to admit that power itself pressures humans towards certain choices. The myth of the Machiavellian villain allowed societies to preserve the illusion of moral purity, while continuing to practice realpolitik behind closed doors. This split between public virtue and private calculation is precisely what Machiavelli had warned about. Appearances matter because people prefer comforting stories to uncomfortable truths. Over time, the adjective detached entirely from the man. Machiavellian came to mean deceitful, heartless, manipulative, yet the historical. Machiavelli was none of these things in his personal life. He valued friendship, he loved his family, he remained loyal to Florence, long after Florence had rejected him. The cruelty he described was analytical, not emotional. He never advocated sadism, only efficiency under necessity. This distinction matters because it reframes his work as diagnostic rather than prescriptive, like a physician describing a disease without celebrating it. Those who accuse the doctor of inventing the illness miss the point. The illness existed long before the diagnosis, and refusing to name it does not make it disappear. Machiavelli believed that ignorance makes societies weaker, not purer. A state that pretends its leaders are always benevolent is more vulnerable than one that assumes ambition and designs safeguards accordingly. This insight would later influence republican constitutions built on checks, balances, and suspicion of concentrated power. The founders of modern democracies understood something Machiavelli understood intuitively, that freedom survives not through trust alone, but through structured mistrust. Ambition must be countered by ambition, power by power, interest by interest. Morality remains vital, but it cannot operate unsupported by institutions that assume human fallibility. This is why Machiavelli belongs not only to tyrants, but also to republicans, reformers, and skeptics. He stands at the beginning of a tradition that refuses to lie to itself about human nature. And that refusal continues to unsettle readers because it demands maturity rather than comfort, clarity rather than consolation. To read Machiavelli honestly is to accept that politics is not a sermon, but a struggle, and that wishing it otherwise does not make it so. The enduring discomfort with Machiavelli comes from the fact that he forces readers to confront a contradiction they would rather avoid: the desire to be governed by goodness alone, while benefiting from the stability created by force, calculation, and compromise. Societies want leaders who are morally pure, yet effective in a world that punishes purity when it is unguarded. Machiavelli shattered the comforting fantasy that ethics alone can sustain political order. He argued that intentions mean little if outcomes collapse into chaos. Hunger, invasion, and civil war are not morally superior to stability, simply because they arise from virtuous weakness. This is why his thought feels cold. It prioritizes consequences over intentions and survival over self-image. Yet beneath this severity lies a deeply ethical concern, the avoidance of greater harm. Machiavelli believed that short, decisive cruelty could prevent prolonged suffering, and that disorder was more destructive than harsh order. This does not make him a lover of violence, but an enemy of illusion. He had seen what happened when leaders hesitated out of fear of moral judgment. He had watched Florence fall, not because its citizens were wicked, but because they were unprepared to defend themselves against those who were not restrained by the same scruples. Idealism without power had failed Savonarola, and it had failed the Republic. Machiavelli concluded that morality divorced from reality becomes a luxury the vulnerable cannot afford. This insight does not abolish ethics, but relocates them. Ethics must be embedded in institutions, strategy, and foresight rather than emotional purity. A ruler who refuses to dirty his hands may preserve his soul, but he risks destroying the community entrusted to him. This tragic dimension of leadership is what Machiavelli articulates without sentimentality. Power forces choices where every option carries moral cost, and pretending otherwise only shifts that cost onto the powerless. This is why his work resonates in moments of crisis, when easy answers disappear and survival itself becomes the question. Every generation that faces instability rediscovers Machiavelli, not because they admire cruelty, but because they recognize necessity. And in that recognition lies the uncomfortable truth that the world does not reward innocence, it rewards preparedness. Machiavelli did not invent this reality, he endured it, observed it, and refused to lie about it. That refusal remains his most dangerous and enduring legacy. Yet Machiavelli was never arguing that power should exist without limits. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings of his work. What he rejected was not morality itself, but naive morality. The belief that good intentions automatically produce good outcomes. For Machiavelli, limits on power must arise from structure, balance, and vigilance, not from trust in personal virtue alone. This is why his Republican writings matter so deeply. In the Discourses, he insists that freedom survives only where power is divided, contested, and constantly checked. A people who rely on the goodness of rulers rather than institutions invite domination. Corruption enters not because humans are uniquely evil, but because they are predictably self-interested. Machiavelli's realism is grounded in consistency, not cynicism. He assumes that people will act in their own interest and designs. Political systems that channel that behavior toward collective stability. In this sense, he is closer to a political engineer than a moral nihilist. Conflict in his view is not a failure of politics, but its raw material. When properly structured conflict prevents stagnation and tyranny. The struggles between elites and common citizens in Rome did not weaken the Republic, they strengthened it. By forcing negotiation, accountability, and adaptation. Suppression of conflict leads to decay because it concentrates power in the hands of those least inclined to surrender it. This insight would later echo through modern constitutional thought, though few would openly credit Machiavelli. He understood that freedom is not maintained by harmony, but by tension. Not by moral preaching, but by incentives and consequences. This perspective makes him unsettling because it denies comforting myths about human perfectibility. But it also empowers societies to protect themselves realistically rather than ideally. Machiavelli trusted people not because he believed they were good, but because he believed they were capable of defending their own interests when given the means. This is a profoundly democratic instinct, even when expressed through harsh language. The tragedy of his reputation is that his most radical defense of popular power was overshadowed by his analysis of princely necessity. Yet both emerge from the same core belief that truth matters more than consolation, and that political survival requires eyes open rather than hearts pure. Machiavelli's final years were marked not by triumph, but by exhaustion, disappointment, and a quiet kind of clarity. He had written works that would outlive empires, yet in his own lifetime he remained marginal, tolerated but never fully trusted. useful but never restored. The irony is painful. A man who understood power better than almost anyone alive was repeatedly denied it. Not because he lacked ability, but because politics punishes those who reveal its mechanics too openly. Rulers forgive enemies more easily than they forgive mirrors. Machiavelli had shown how power truly operates, and that knowledge made him dangerous even when he posed no threat. In a world built on appearances, the analyst of appearances is always suspect. When the Medici finally commissioned him to write the histories of Florence, it was less an act of reconciliation than containment. He was allowed to speak, but only within boundaries. Allowed to analyze the past, but not shape the future. Machiavelli accepted because he had always loved Florence more than pride. Yet even in compliance he remained subversive, writing truths sideways, embedding critique inside narrative, trusting that careful readers would understand. He knew direct confrontation fails where patience and ambiguity endure. This too was Machiavelli. Not deception for gain, but strategy for survival. His health declined steadily, years of stress, poverty, torture, and disappointment taking their toll. He watched others take positions he had once held. Younger men, with less experience, shaping a world he understood far better than they did. The bitterness was real, but it never fully hardened into despair. He continued to write, to teach, to debate, to think. Because for Machiavelli, the life of the mind was not consolation. It was identity. To stop thinking politically would have meant ceasing to exist. When the Florentine Republic was briefly restored in 1527, it should have been his vindication. Instead, it was his final rejection. The new leaders saw him not as a loyal servant of the old republic, but as a compromised figure. A man who had written for the Medici. Trust once lost is rarely recovered. Machiavelli understood this cruel logic better than anyone. Yet understanding does not soften its sting. Within weeks of being passed over for office, he fell gravely ill, and on June 21st, 1527, he died, aged 58, convinced that his life's work had failed. He did not live to see the prince published, did not know that his name would become immortal or infamous. He died believing he had been forgotten. History would reverse that judgment completely, but not kindly. His posthumous fame came wrapped in distortion, fear, and moral panic. The adjective Machiavellian became a curse, severed from the man who had written passionately about liberty, institutions, and the dangers of concentrated power. Perhaps this is the final lesson Machiavelli offers, that truth often survives only by being misunderstood, that those who describe the world as it is will be hated by those who depend on illusion, and that the price of intellectual honesty is frequently exile. If not in body, then in reputation. Machiavelli paid that price in full. Yet the questions he asked still confront us. How power should be structured, how freedom can be preserved, and whether morality without realism is virtue at all. He did not give comforting answers, but he gave necessary ones, and in doing so he ensured that, whether praised or condemned, his voice would never be silent. Voiceover friendly, strong ending. Casath, Niccolo Machiavelli, did not leave us easy answers. He left us uncomfortable questions. Questions about power, about morality, about survival in a world that rarely rewards innocence. He showed us that politics is not a fairy tale of good and evil, but a struggle shaped by fear, ambition, chance, and human weakness. 5 centuries later, his words still disturb us, because they still describe us. We still live in a world where appearances matter more than truth, where leaders promise virtue and practice necessity. where the line between idealism and realism is painfully thin. Machiavelli did not ask us to love power. He asked us to understand it, to look at it without illusions, and decide for ourselves what price we are willing to pay for order, for freedom, for stability. If this story changed how you see Machiavelli, leave your thoughts in the comments. If you found meaning in this journey through history, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing for more stories that live in the long shadow of the past. Until our next journey, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves.